Getting the goods, so we're going to get started. All right, we're good to go. All right, thank you everyone for bearing with us. Looks like technical difficulties are over. So just to pick up from the last thought, obviously it is difficult to compare anything to the pain of people who are living in Gaza and experiencing this horror directly. But experiencing this as Palestinian Americans in this country is incredibly difficult and infuriating because of the political environment that we live in. Because we operate in a media discourse where it is just utterly dehumanizing to turn on your TV at any moment to look at what coverage of this looks like. You know, Palestine and Israel is paradoxically one of the most covered issues in our media, and yet one of the least understood, which tells you something about the quality of that coverage, of the fact that it's utterly devoid of context, that it's all sensationalized, and it's all built into a fundamentally broken narrative in which, on the right end of the spectrum, it is Israel protagonists, Palestinians bad guys, and on the more liberal end of the spectrum, the one that we're supposed to be feeling a little bit better about, it is Israel protagonist, Hamas bad guys, and Palestinians innocent victims in the middle. And what's missing from that entire spectrum is a fundamental truth that is not permitted to appear on American media, which is the fact that the Israeli government is waging a war against the Palestinian people, and the fact that Palestinian civilians are not so-called collateral damage, but they are the intended targets of this genocidal onslaught. You see it in the statements of Israeli leaders who talk about the need to thin the population in Gaza down to a minimum, who talk about cutting off food and fuel and electricity and water to the entire population, who use dehumanizing language when talking about Palestinians, referring to them as human animals, or quoting biblical passages that reference the Amalek, genocidal quotes about the slaughter of an entire people, including their children and babies. You see it in the rhetoric of Israeli soldiers who are caught on tape saying that what they're engaged in is the mass slaughter of Palestinians, destroying everything in sight to make sure that Palestinians have nothing to return to. You see it in footage of Palestinian children and grandparents who are being targeted by sniper fire, caught on tape when there's nothing going on around. The evidence is overwhelming, and yet that part of the narrative is basically not permitted to appear. And when you look at what the political establishment rhetoric is like, frankly, it's even worse. That the spectrum ranges from enthusiastic participation in the slaughter of Palestinians to unenthusiastic participation. The best we can hope for in the dominant political forces is unenthusiastic participation, where people are like, oh, too many Palestinian civilians are dying, maybe Israel can do a little bit more. But in the meantime, the flow of weapons to this genocidal regime continues completely unimpeded. And American policy on this issue has been broken for a very, very long time, long before this latest phase. For literally decades, Israel has been imposing an illegal occupation on Palestinians, a system of apartheid in which Palestinians are not equal human beings to Israelis. And even within people who have Israeli citizenship, Palestinian citizens of Israel are not equal to Jewish citizens of Israel. It is a regime that for decades has destroyed homes, has killed protesters with impunity, as documented by every major human rights organization in the world, where Palestinian children rot in Israeli detention, where they are brutalized and on the receiving end of torture and physical violence on a systemic fashion. That is what Palestinians endured day in and day out for decades. And yet, what you hear from our political establishment is endless references to Israel being our greatest ally in the Middle East, a beacon of democracy and freedom in a region, and all kinds of ugly racist imagery about what this terrible region is and what Israel is supposed to be in comparison to it. And that's not how the rest of the world sees it. The rest of the world has a much more accurate picture of what is unfolding. And so the rhetoric coming out of Washington has always been jarring in contrast to that reality. And In a way, it would be interesting to see how far down the path of extremism can the Israeli government go before American rhetoric shifts. And what the past year and change have proven is that there seems to be no limit to how far Israel can go, and American political rhetoric becomes even more and more absurd, to the point of utter lunacy. That you have in the Israeli government right now ministers like Smotrich, who openly describes himself as a fascist homophobe, who supports a policy of segregating babies in hospitals between Arab and Jewish babies. And you have somebody like Ben Gvir, who is now in charge of national security, who was convicted by Israeli courts of anti-Palestinian racism and incitement and terrorism. This is the person who's now in charge of Israeli policy on security. And you have this genocidal onslaught that has killed more than 16,000 Palestinian children over the past 10 months in the most brutal ways imaginable. And you have a case before the International Court of Justice about whether Israel is committing genocide. You have the International Criminal Court prosecutor calling for arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and for Gallant for the crimes that they are committing in Palestine and in Gaza. And yet, the political rhetoric out of Washington has yet to change. We still talk about Israel as this wonderful country that's a democracy that we support and love, and there has to be a point at which we say enough is enough. And this cannot be explained by domestic politics in America alone. This is like, well, this is what Americans think and feel, so that's just unique about the United States. The population has shifted drastically, because even though corporate media's coverage of this issue has been absolutely horrendous for a very long time, improving, but ever so slowly, young people in this country have a different source of information. They access information through alternative channels, through social media. They get a more unfiltered reality of what is unfolding in Palestine. And when you look at opinion polling at this point, you see that an overwhelming majority of young people in this country oppose the current slaughter in Gaza and oppose American support for that slaughter. When you look at the Democratic Party base, you see that if Democrats actually, instead of doing what they're currently doing, had actually called for an arms embargo on Israel and put it into practice, that support for them would actually increase. So politically, it makes sense to put an end to American support for this genocidal slaughter. Strategically, it's a no-brainer that American standing is harmed immensely in the world by the fact that we claim to be a country championing freedom and human rights and democracy, and yet we're enabling an apartheid regime to engage in this slaughter. And then there's the much more fundamental moral level, of which you don't have to be particularly politically savvy or strategic to know and understand that the slaughter of children with our money and weapons is morally indefensible, and it has to come to an end immediately.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for being here, and thank you to my incredible fellow panelists. You guys are incredible. So my name is Ruwa Romman. I'm a Georgia State representative. I happen to be the only Muslim woman in the Georgia State House and the first and only elected Palestinian in the entire state. In fact, me and my colleague Sam Rasool, who's up in Virginia, are the only two elected Palestinians in the entirety of the Southeast. So we kind of take on a very unique role, for lack of a better word, in that region. And to really kind of like hone in the weirdness of sort of where I come from and growing up in Georgia, you know, I like to tell folks that I graduated from the same high school as Marjorie Taylor Greene. So to get an understanding of like, you know, how unique Georgia is and its wide spectrum, you know, we've got, you know, that sort of kind of, I guess, discrepancy between folks. But I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about a state-level perspective. And the reason I want to talk about a state-level perspective is specifically because a lot of times I get this question of, why is everyone talking about this, right? There are 1,000 other issues. Why is this always coming up? You know, we should be focused on healthcare. We should be focused on funding our schools. We should be you know, funding all this other stuff. So I want to tell you what's been going on in a state like Georgia that's not unique and has happened in a lot of states as well. Before I was elected, Georgia passed an anti-BDS law. The law forced anybody who worked for the state, at the time getting paid $500 or more to basically sign an oath saying that they would not boycott the state of Israel. Well, there was a speaker at Georgia State University. She was supposed to get an honorarium. A lawsuit went forward, and the lawsuit was actually successful. This was an infringement on her First Amendment rights. The problem is the state then came back during session, turned around, and upped that amount to $100,000, which means we haven't had a plaintiff to actually address, or I think maybe there is one now, but for a long time there hasn't been a plaintiff to address the law that exists on the books. And this was before I even got there. And to be quite honest with you, I have had no intention in running for office. I've been politically involved. I've loved civic engagement. I've loved educating the community about how to kind of do this work, because I do think it's important. But the idea of like my name being on those flyers frankly gave me hives and freaked me out. And it was through like a weird confluence of events that I kind of got pushed into this. And I remember very clearly talking to some of those stakeholders that asked me to run, and I said, fine, but only because it's a state level, and I don't have to deal with Palestine because my grandfather had just passed. And it's, I think sometimes what we forget, because we all have to present ourselves a certain way, is that this is personally very painful. I think sometimes it feels very self-indulgent to talk about it, but to be quite honest with you, that was my boundary. I said, all right, I'll do this. I'll be sort of a representation, but at state level, it's at least somewhat safe. And within about not even a few weeks that I got there, one of the first bills that was introduced was a bill to define anti-Semitism. And the bill leveraged what's called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the IRA definition. And the definition itself includes multiple examples that conflate criticism of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism. And what that bill would have done is it criminalizes, frankly, me sharing my family's story. I mean, at a most basic human, fundamental level, it would have made it that much harder to talk about my grandfather and keep his memory alive. And this came in spite of the fact that I spoke to a lot of colleagues about it, explained to them the problem with this bill. And even in a state like Georgia that was Republican controlled, the bill actually failed year after year after year after year. And it usually ran out of time. Last year, because we have a biennial, it started last year, it started early, and just explaining to my colleagues went a really long way, because it's clear that, yes, so much of this is systemic, but so much of it is also from ignorance. A lot of people don't have the vocabulary, knowledge, and understanding of how far-reaching this issue is in every level of government. And I spoke to them, I explained it to them. They actually amended the bill to take out the IRA definition and the president's Trump's executive order at the time. It went to the Senate, session ended, and we were gonna pick right back up where we started the next January. And 7 months after session ended, six months after session ended, is when October 7th happened. And we got pulled into special session because our maps were also found to be unconstitutional. So suddenly, within 2 months of October 7th, we were right back in session. I was a brand new legislator. I was the only elected Palestinian. And suddenly, my responsibilities burst beyond the boundaries of my district. All of a sudden, I went from being responsible for 60,000 constituents to truly and sincerely not just being a symbol for people, but their only recourse to getting help, whether it's trying to get family members out, trying to get a meeting with their members of Congress, trying to get anybody to just listen to them. At the time, there wasn't even a huge ask beyond a ceasefire. It was just, please, for the love of God, I've got family here, here, and here. I've already lost this many people. Like, help us stop this. And, we don't get staff as state representatives. It's usually just us. We're lucky if we can, fundraise to have somebody part-time. And we went into December. I was already trying to sort of deal with a whole new set of constituent service requests. And they brought a resolution to the House floor and the Senate floor expressing support for Israel and everything that it was doing. Half the resolution was about Israel and the other half was about anti-Semitism, because that's what they do. They love, especially Republican evangelicals, in a very ironic way, are so committed to anti-Semitism while continuing to spread anti-Semitism and literally legalize it. It's the most bizarre, and that's not to say there aren't those that enable it. I mean, there's a lot that happens in my caucus. I really don't want to, go too much in detail. But What was really fascinating to me is I actually sat down with Republican leadership. I developed really good relationships with them. I was incredibly grateful for that opportunity at least. And I said, I don't even want you to talk about Palestinians because I know you don't care. And I was very honest about it. But I was like, can you at least just change it? Instead of support Israel, we support the Israeli people. I was like, that's my ask. If you don't want this to turn into a thing, instead of approving the mass bombing and mass slaughter of innocent people, if your concern really is about the people of Israel, just change one word to 3. And they refused. They refused to budge. They refused to amend it. They had expressed a lot of sympathy and empathy, but it was a lot of, it's just something we got to do. It's just something we got to do. That's just the way it is. Which is ironic because these are people who control the House, the Senate, and the governorship. So I don't know. What do I know? But it was so fascinating because, again, in my entire chamber of 170 people, there are literally 2 members I do not speak with. 2. Everybody else we have a great working relationship with. And I remember in that December, I went to the well to speak against the resolution. And I was like, you're trying to make us choose, basically, between fighting anti-Semitism and standing up for Palestinians, and I'm not going to let you do that. And I actually called out specific people who I knew were their constituents. And I looked each of those members in the eyes who I knew those were their constituents, and I said, so-and-so from this city just lost 100 family members already. So-and-so from this city lost 68 family members already. So-and-so from that city just lost 23 family members. The day the resolution came to the floor, a resolution that they did not need to bring to the floor. And thankfully, the majority of my caucus actually chose not to vote for it, and we walked out in protest. But I share that for a couple of reasons. One, both the anti-Semitism bill and that resolution did not receive the majority of support from my caucus. Even though I'd only been there 10 months, even though, frankly, I'm a pain in everybody's backside, which is fine. I'm young, and I don't really, adhere to a lot of the norms that exist in politics. It's just weird. But it came from them, and it came through an understanding that this is just wrong. But on the flip side, there was no institutional support to say, all right, if you take this position, we'll stand with you. And it really came to head. So we had special session in December, and then session this year was when the anti-Semitism bill finally came for a final vote. They literally put us in recess just to make sure that when the Senate passed it, there would be no time to delay it when it came back because they amended it back to the old bad version of the bill. And I remember so distinctly not knowing what was going to happen. This was post-October 7th. And I assumed that compared to previous years, it was probably going to get more votes. It passed. And I think if you only focus on the loss, you miss out on the fact that less people voted for this bill this year than at any other time that it has come up before and ran out of time. There was already a shift happening and an understanding of the fact that addressing systemic discrimination is not mutually exclusive from stopping a genocide. There was already an understanding within my colleagues who, a lot of them either were very understanding of the issue and had come from those sort of intersectional organizing backgrounds, or didn't really actually know that much about it, but just, it was wrong. And I share that because I think that what's awful about the situation is that there's so much urgency in this moment because we are trying to save lives. But at the same time, in just 10 months, we have been able to shift public sentiment and an understanding of this issue in a way that I never thought was possible during my lifetime. When I go to a protest, the majority of people there don't look like me. They're not Arab, they're not Muslim, they're not Palestinian. They are, like we said, multi-faith, multiracial, multi-generational. And granted, for a child who is starving, that is not much solace, but it reminds me that if we had just had this kind of a coalition 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if we had started those conversations, people were willing to accept them, instead of being progressive but for Palestine 10 years ago, I firmly believe we could have prevented this genocide. But now we're at a point, at an inflection point, one that I firmly believe in based on what I am watching happening at the bottom of the ticket, right? The place where people forget, the place where a city council member can win by 4 votes, the place where a state senate primary is won by 76 votes. that is where the change starts, because each of us makes up a congressional, a few of us make up a congressional seat, and a few of us make up, a state seat. And I share that because I'm not trying to give you false hope, but what I'm saying is that there are a lot of people that want us to believe that there's nothing that's going to change, and that this is the way it's been for 80 years, and we just need to accept it for what it is and just hope for scraps. And I hope what I leave you with is this understanding that it is changing, and now is not the time to take our foot off the gas. Now is actually a time for us to lean in and make sure of two things. One, we protect our coalition through November, because that is crucial, right? The election is happening. It's, timing isn't something we can control. But what happens on November 6th, what happens after November, what happens after that election day is going to be determined by how well we protect our coalition, because I watched it happen in my state. They primaried a state senator, not for voting no on this bill, just walking on it. She said, I don't think this is right. And they primaried her. She was outspent, she was out-organized, and yet we still beat her opponent by 70%. Even though she represented one of the largest concentrations of those who supported this bill, including those organizations, by the way. But we came together and we said, you know what, you stood with us, we're gonna catch you. And that inside sort of outside pressure that matters the most really does change a lot, but it starts with each of us. And so I hope that even in this despair and carnage and urgency of this moment, that we recognize there are these immediate asks, and we recognize that there could be a difference on the horizon.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ruwa. Thank you to the incredible panel, and to AAI, Jim, Maya, and of course Rainbow Push for hosting us today. I'm the last speaker, and I won't go over half an hour. My name is Abdelnasser Rashid. I'm the state representative of the 21st District here in Illinois. I represent parts of the greatest city in the world, Chicago. Welcome to Chicago, everyone who's coming here for the DNC. And my district goes from Berwyn to Bridgeview and west to villages like Countryside. I represent a beautiful Latino community. I represent parts of Chicagoland's Little Palestine. And I'm very proud to represent Summit, Illinois, where Mamie Till Mobley lived part of her childhood. Mamie Till Mobley was the mother of Emmett Till, who was brutally murdered in Mississippi. And she had to she made a very, very heart-wrenching choice against the objection of others to have an open casket so that the world can see and white America can see the result of racial hatred, what it means, what it looks like. Rather than simply fighting for civil rights, she showed Emmett's mutilated body to everybody. And that's what Palestinians right now are asking for us to look at in Gaza, for people to see, not to look away. It's heart-wrenching, it's difficult, and it's not about, just being gory, but about really, so my wife yesterday asked me, did you see the video of the building that collapsed with the girl's hand sticking out? I hadn't, but I'm not gonna allow myself to get desensitized to that, and I don't think we should expect for anyone to get desensitized to that. That was the images of the Vietnam War were part of what catalyzed the anti-war movement, and Mamie Till's dedication helped catalyze the civil rights movement. I want to make a few points today. The first is that this panel here really represents the Democratic Party more than many people who are speaking at the DNC. We represent the Democratic base and the American public more broadly, including many Republicans who support a ceasefire and who support an arms embargo against Israel. And of course on Palestine, but on so many other issues as well. So I think it's important to note that the upper echelons of the party are still very much closed to hearing voices that need to be heard, but the people are with us, and that's something that you can't put the lid back on. You simply cannot. Particularly because the carnage in Gaza is being witnessed. People like Hani who are sharing his family stories, and so many others who who are bearing witness to the genocide that's unfolding. There is no way to turn back from that. And thankfully, people have other sources of information other than Fox and CNN, so they can see stories and respond to that. So that's my first point, is we actually represent the base, both of the party and the broader American public. The second point I want to make is that AIPAC's ROI is getting worse and worse. I mean, the idea that, I have an MBA from UChicago, so forgive me for talking in finance and economics terms, but the idea that you'd spend $20 million on one primary, I don't give them credit for beating Jamal Bowman. Are you kidding me? That's money that you spend, that's more money that's spent on many Senate seats, US Senate seats, right? So the ROI, the amount of money that you have to spend per vote is just outrageous. And I don't know about unsustainable, because they're going to keep pouring money in, but it's going to work less and less, and there's going to be a reaction from people who don't like that kind of spending and who know that democratic politics is being bought by Trumpian MAGA Republicans who are undermining our democracy and undermining so many of the other things that Americans stand for. And that's going to get exposed. That's going to get exposed. We don't also talk, I lament the loss of Jamal and of Corey, but there are plenty other places where they lost or they did not get involved because they knew they would lose. So I think it's important for us to understand that they are desperate. They are responding with desperation and with coercion, because they are losing public opinion, and there are people like us who are, while still not quite leaders in the halls of power, we are there, and we are talking to people who are making decisions, and we are having a major influence, as my colleague, State Representative Romman, just mentioned. Our voices are being heard, even in the halls of power, more than ever before, while we still have, obviously, a long way to go. Another point that I want to make is their unflinching support for genocide is costing America on the world stage. The idea that China is brokering a reconciliation agreement between the different Palestinian factions, what does that say about American leadership? What does that say about America's place in the world when you have other countries stepping up to do the diplomatic work that America purports to want to do and purports to have the leadership to carry out? They know that that is costing America standing in the world, and they don't care, unfortunately. And the final thing, I want to build upon what was said about the importance of coalitions. The fact that the mayor of Chicago is hosting the DNC just a few days ago, called Israel's war in Gaza genocidal, shows you that that we have support like never before, and that the path forward, as dim as it looks like right now, and I don't want to sugarcoat just how devastating the carnage is, just how devastating it's a genocide. It's a genocide. I mean, and there is no way to frankly, all we can offer are silver linings in a genocide. We can't really celebrate victories because we allowed a genocide to happen, fundamentally. The only thing we can look at is silver linings in the future. But those silver linings are there, and people, allies are with us and are pushing on the Democratic Party, and I say that to encourage us to continue pushing. Let's not listen to the voices who, one, want us to think that we are powerless, or those who think that it's entirely about working on the inside. No, we need to continue pushing because the party will only respond to incredible pressure. And so I want to thank you all for being partners in this work and for joining us here today. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. You represent what my Uncle Farid used to call the new generator. Each in your own way bring to an audience the issues and the personhood of Palestinians. I have a book back there I wrote in 1978 called Palestinians, the Invisible Victims, and the theme of it was that in the American mind, it was Israeli humanity versus the Palestine problem, when it was even said, or it was the Arab problem, or it was the problem. It was how do you solve the problem so that the people can live in peace? And that remains at the highest levels. I mean, we're negotiating now to free Israeli hostages. It's not to end the carnage. I mean, that's the way it's framed. But in the mind of the constituencies that we're talking about who are changing direction, young people see it differently, black voters see it differently, Latino and Asians see it differently, progressive Jews see it differently. And it's because, yes, social media, Elmer, you're completely right, and the role you play has been really consequential in this. It's also because each of you, in your own way, have brought this issue to people who know you. My father used to say, customers will come back to the store if they like you. You know, I'm not going to tell it now. There's a story about a lesson I learned from a congressman. I went and pounded on the desk, you got to support this. I said, and he made a joke, and I said, it's not funny. This is serious. He said, I'll tell you what's serious. I got to run for office, and I got people who don't want me to be dealing with this issue. He said, why don't you get a sense of humor, come back and see me. It stung. We later became really close friends, but the issue of being able to have people like you and want to work with you, which is what you do, right? Which is what you do, Abdelnasser. I mean, there are people who respect you because you're part of their work on other issues, and they like you and trust you as a person. And then bringing it to a larger audience with a human message, which is what you have done, Hani, which is what you, Layla, have done, and organize it, Layla, with an incredible effort and uncommitted, is of consequence. And Rania, the work you've done with people, we won't even get into the names of celebrities and stars of different sorts and political leadership who, yeah, you've lost some jobs, but you've made some friends and kept some people who would not be talking or knowing this issue if it hadn't been for you. And so we're at a confluence of so many things happening here, but at the end of the day, the confluence and the way to make it matter is that people have to be the agents of this. All this could be happening, right? Genocide, images in social media, all that, but if there weren't people to be the agents of taking that and communicating it, it wouldn't happen. Now, yesterday we had a panel at the DNC, first time ever, and I thought about it a lot because, you know, people said, oh, it's got to be on the main stage or nothing. Well, number one, if it were on the main stage, it would have been scripted, and none of the stuff that got said would have been said. Number two, we were there, and they knew they had to have us there because, Layla, the work you did said to them, we want to win, we got to let these voices be heard. And number three, they have the good sense to know that this is an issue that has to be talked about in a way differently. Think about what Kamala Harris said after the meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu. Two things stuck out in my mind. One is she said, this issue is not binary. When has an American politician ever said that before? It's not binary. It's not Israel and the problem. It's people, real people on both sides. And the other thing she said was that, yes, you have the right to defend yourself. It's how you do it that matters. She's getting it. Now, people want things to happen quick. It doesn't happen quick. I mean, Al Gore used to say ocean liners and political policy, government policy, take a long time to turn around. But we are turning in a different direction. And don't give up hope. Don't give up heart, and don't give up the work. And it's because when this chapter gets written of the changes made, it'll be you guys who have carried this forward, you and so many others like you, in the different areas of work you do. Every person you talk to matters, and Palestinians who have no voice do have a voice. It's yours, and it's yours, and it's those of you watching. So thank you. These voices matter, and I appreciate everything you do. We're now going to go to an issue of UNRWA and talk about the work it does, and Maya Berry's going to head that up.
Okay, here we go. We are still streaming live, and we were supposed to give you all a break, but I'm afraid that our glitch allowed us to continue. Talk louder. Thank you. Okay, here's what I need. I love everybody in this room, and I know you all want to talk to each other because you're all awesome, but we're going to continue the live stream. And our next panel, to be clear, is focused on the issue of the law and our obligations to both Palestine and Palestinians. You've heard from my colleagues, and they shared with you importantly, I'm going to, please.
Can we have your attention, please? Please, quiet in the room. Quiet in the room. The lady is talking. Maya, please.
Can you follow me around? Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. While we change the stage for the next panel, I want to just make a programming note. This is day 2. Day 3 is our final day. That's tomorrow. And the importance of this conversation is for many reasons, including the fact that it is the morally right thing to do, including the fact that it's the United States policy that has enabled this genocide. And this panel is going to explain to us that it's also based on the fact that we have legal obligations, both based on international law, US law, and the United Nations since the partition plan of 1948. So, I'm going to ask our next speakers to come up to the stage. I'm not going to turn the microphone over to you until my colleagues stop talking. Omar B said if I just say shh. I hate it when Omar B's right, and he's always right. Okay. I'm sorry, the OCD, might have you stand up or can I move the chair? You guys can speak. I'm just going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much, everybody, again, for being with us. As I said, it is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do in terms of U.S. policy, but it's also what we are required to do based on U.S. law, international law, and what has happened since the creation of Israel in 1948. Our presenters are going to share with us 2 perspectives as to our obligations. May I have the door in the back closed? Thank you. Both speakers have profound knowledge on these issues and can literally spend the entire hour and a half talking individually and providing the context that we need to understand this better. But I've asked them today to each take one topic of it, and we will have the opportunity for questions from all of you after their presentations. They're going to speak from the podium, so I invite first Zaha Hassan, who will then turn it over to Mara Kronenfeld after, and then we'll take the opportunity for Q&A. Zaha. Thank you so much.
Oh, here, I got it to move a little bit. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am incredibly grateful to all of the conveners today of this panel for inviting me. I have a special connection to Rainbow Push and to Jesse Jackson. My first presidential election, I voted for Jesse Jackson. I was 6 years old. No, I'm just kidding. I just gave away my age. But anyhow, so it's kind of a full circle to be here in this moment when you have just heard from the previous panels how important the Palestinian, the Arab vote is in this election. And thinking back about when I cast my first ballot for president and where we were then. So there's a lot that's changed, but there's a lot that stayed the same. And I want to talk a bit about today a couple of things. I'm going to spend my time on a couple of things that I want to share. First, I want to address Why is it that we don't hear much about the legal rules that are applicable to Israel's occupation of Palestine from US policymakers? Where has the law gone? Why doesn't it feature more prominently in US policy? Second, I want to look at what the law actually says about Israel-Palestine conflict resolution. The International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, the judicial arm of the UN, issued a landmark decision about the legal consequences of Israel's prolonged occupation in July. Many people, maybe a lot of you, haven't heard about what that court said. In January, it also ruled on the provisional measures that have to be taken in Gaza to prevent genocide. The case was brought by South Africa. So I'm going to talk about those two cases and what they say about the legal obligations that should be a part of US policy, but that aren't. So first, where has the law gone? Why don't we hear much about the legal rules that apply when it comes to Israel's occupation of Palestine? So in the context of Israel-Palestine peace and US policy, international law has historically not figured prominently. For example, after World War I, when President Woodrow Wilson recognized that Arabs in the Middle East were entitled to self-determination, as a matter of policy, the US deprioritized Palestinian statehood and the national aspirations of Palestinian Arabs, and instead supported the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. And when in 1948, the US actively supported the partition of Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish, it did so against the wishes of 70% of the population who were Arab Palestinians, and despite the fact that only a slim majority of Jews lived in what was supposed to be the Jewish state, and it allocated 55% of the land area for the Jewish state. And while the US recognized the right of Palestinian refugees who were forced out of their homes in 1948 in what became the State of Israel, 3/4 of Palestinian population had been displaced in what was known as the Nakba. The US did not actively pursue the return of refugees as a matter of US policy, nor did it work to ensure that the establishment of an Arab state followed the US recognition of a state of Israel. And so the UN partition plan has been left on the table and somewhat discarded. But it wasn't until 1993 that international law was actually viewed as an obstacle to peace in US policy terms. This was when the series of agreements between Israel and the PLO were signed and known as the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were viewed as a breakthrough by many at the time for a number of reasons. First, Israel had finally recognized that the Palestine Liberation Organization was the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Now, this was less for the benefit of Palestinians than it was for Israel. If Israel didn't acknowledge the PLO's legal personality, then it could not expect the PLO and Palestinians to be bound by terms of any agreement. Second, the Oslo Accords set a definitive deadline for getting a comprehensive agreement on the contentious issues that needed to be resolved, including on refugees, Jerusalem's status, settlements, and what the border would be. Third, the Oslo Accords also called for maintaining a status quo in the occupied territories. This would be during the negotiations, meaning there should be no settlement expansion and de facto annexation. And it stated that Gaza and the West Bank were one territorial unit. So while those were important achievements of the Oslo Accords, the Accords suffered from fatal flaws. Among them was that Oslo failed to identify the objective of negotiations. That seems crazy to us. Like, shouldn't an agreement identify what the purpose of the agreement is? But there was no mention of a Palestinian state being the goal. The other fatal problem with the Accords is that there was only one reference to international law, and it was to UN Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338, which call for an end to Israel's occupation and mutual recognition between states involved in the 1967 war. Those resolutions do not explicitly mention establishment of a state of Palestine or the rights of Palestinians. In fact, the Oslo Accords do not mention that Palestinians have any legal rights at all vis-à-vis Israel. Why didn't Palestinians demand that international law be explicitly named as the terms of reference for negotiations in the Oslo Accords? If you ask the Palestinians who negotiated the Oslo Accords, they'll tell you that if they explicitly referenced international law, Israel would never have signed the agreements and would have never engaged in negotiations. To make up for this failing, though, they said that they relied on assurances from the US that it would act as an honest broker to address the imbalance of power between Israel and the Palestinian people. The US had become the sole superpower, remember, at that time, and it had a special relationship with Israel that it still has today. The Palestinian negotiators took the US's word on faith. Oslo's 5-year deadline passed in 1999, and over the course of the last 3 decades of on and off again peace talks, Israeli settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem went from 240,000 to more than 750,000 today. Not only did the settler population mushroom under Oslo, but on every single one of the contentious issues that Palestinians and Israelis were supposed to come to an agreement on, known as the final status issues, which include a shared Jerusalem, the borders, the status of Palestinian refugees and settlements, the US took it upon itself to resolve them in Israel's favor. For example, on Jerusalem, and when negotiations were at the height of their time, Congress under the Clinton administration called for the Holy City to remain Israel's undivided capital and for the US embassy to be moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This is the US embassy to Israel. Trump ultimately was the president to move that embassy in 2018, and the Biden administration has kept it in place. On borders, US policy since the George W. Bush administration has been that the 1967 border is only a baseline, and that adjustments should be made to take into account certain demographic realities. So US policy essentially became that the ever-growing blocks of Israeli settlements should be annexed to Israel under any peace deal. And on refugees, the Obama administration made it a prerequisite for peace negotiations that Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. This effectively meant that Palestinian refugees from 1948 would not be given the choice of whether to return to their homes and property inside Israel. This position was also legally problematic for Palestinian citizens of Israel. It opened the door 2 years later for Israel to pass the Jewish nation-state law, which provided that only Jewish people have a right to self-determination in the area in which Israel considers it Israel. And in his Peace to Prosperity plan, President Trump reaffirmed the positions of all these previous administrations, but he went further by deciding that Israel was entitled to annex at least a third of the West Bank and that not a single Palestinian refugee would return to Israel or resettle in the West Bank or Gaza. So considering the failure of the Oslo peace process and US policy, Palestinians have tried to access legal mechanisms to advance their rights and claims. The US has strongly opposed those efforts across Democrat or Republican administrations. So when Palestinians tried to make Palestine a full member of the UN to affirm the two-state solution and to be able to sit in bodies like the Security Council, the US has opposed it. When Palestinians seek bilateral recognition from the remaining states in Western Europe that have yet to recognize Palestine, the US uses its influence with the third states to prevent it. And when Palestinians go to the International Criminal Court to seek accountability for war crimes, or if the General Assembly seeks an advisory opinion or third states seek a ruling from the International Court of Justice, the US opposes it. Not only does the U.S. oppose Palestinian efforts or any effort toward Israeli accountability, it calls these efforts provocative unilateral actions, and it equates them with Israeli settlement construction. Now, why would recognition of Palestine as a state, which affirms the two-state solution, or seeking accountability for international crimes be compared to settlement construction, which is actually illegal and a war crime, and is meant to destroy the two-state solution? The U.S. argues that they both prejudice negotiations. Now, that explanation is really hard to accept, given what I just explained about how U.S. administrations have bit by bit chipping at the final status positions of Palestinians on issues like Jerusalem, refugee rights, and settlements, etc. That certainly prejudices negotiations, but against Palestinians. Not only has U.S. policy prejudiced final status issues between Israelis and Palestinians, it infringes on international law, it legitimizes violations of Palestinian rights, and it destroys the possibility for a two-state solution. So, I've talked about why the law has been undermined by U.S. policy, but what does the law actually require? So the ICJ's recent advisory opinion of last month on Israel's prolonged occupation and its ruling in January on the case brought by South Africa under the Genocide Convention are instructive. In December 2022, the UN General Assembly asked the World Court, this is the judicial arm of the United Nations, for a legal opinion on what are the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and how does it affect the legal status of the occupation? Here are the points that are most important for us to understand about that opinion. Number one, it said that Gaza is occupied territory, and it's been occupied territories even after 2005, when Israel redeployed troops to the perimeter of Gaza while maintaining a siege and blockade over Palestinians there. It said that Israel's policies, its discriminatory practices, its Jewish settlements, its home demolitions, its two-tiered legal system, one for Palestinians and the other for Jewish settlers, amounts to annexation, it's illegal, and it's a crime of apartheid. It said that all settlers must be evacuated from the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and that Israel must withdraw from the occupied territories immediately. No negotiations, none of that talk about Israel's security. It needs to happen immediately. Now, it's up to the General Assembly to advise member states, international organizations, and the UN system on the obligations that flow from this World Court decision. But we should be under no illusions here. U.S. policy is unlikely to change because the ICJ opinion, which is advisory in nature, is not legally binding, even though it's a statement of law. The U.S. explained in its brief to the ICJ that it opposed the UN General Assembly seeking the legal advice of the World Court because it said doing so, quote, risks driving the parties further away from the objective of a two-state solution, unquote. It's important to recall that at the time the U.S. opposed the General Assembly's referral to the ICJ, Israel had just formed a new coalition government that included two ultranationalist racist politicians, one of whom had plans for the voluntary, quote, voluntary removal of Palestinians from the West Bank. And when the U.S. submitted its written brief to the court, the ICJ had found already that there was a plausible case of genocide taking place in Gaza. Now, it's hard to imagine how seeking enforcement of international law in fora, such as the Security Council or the World Court, makes matters more difficult between Israelis and Palestinians. In fact, I would argue that the best chance for a negotiated political solution lies in disincentivizing Israel's violations of international law by ensuring that there's accountability for Israeli violations. The U.S. also wrote in its brief that the only way to end the occupation is through bilateral negotiations that address Israel's security concerns. The problem with this position is that it gives Israel veto power to indefinitely maintain its occupation. In fact, in 2014, Secretary of State John Kerry expressed, quote, total confidence that Israel's security requirements could be met with a plan that he and General John Allen prepared at that time. Yet, Netanyahu refused to even consider the plan, demanding that Israel maintain overarching security control over the West Bank forever. Later, Kerry wrote in his memoir that it was clear, quote, Bibi was not interested in actually addressing the security questions in a way that could allow for the eventual withdrawal of the IDF, that's the Israeli army. He concluded, quote, this wasn't about security. And for 8 years, it still isn't about security. It's about colonizing the occupied territories and displacing Palestinians. And now, with regard to the case brought by South Africa at the ICJ alleging Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, the case on the merits has not been decided. But in January, the ICJ ruled that South Africa had made out a plausible case that genocide's taking place. The court's provisional measures ruling called on Israel to stop all killing of Palestinians without qualification. Arguably, you can't do that without a total ceasefire, though the court did not explicitly call for one. The court also said that Israel had to take immediate and effective measures to allow humanitarian assistance into Gaza to prevent starvation and death. Again, this is impossible to do without a total ceasefire. And finally, the court called on Israel to end its genocidal incitement. In light of the ICJ's ruling on provisional measures, the U.S. is obligated to stop its offensive weapons transfers to Israel. The U.S. is a signatory to the Genocide Convention and has accepted to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. Failing to stop the weapons transfers to Israel following that ICJ ruling could make the U.S. complicit in genocide. The U.S. has also recognized ICJ rulings on provisional measures cases are legally binding. It did so in the context of the case that was brought between Ukraine and Russia. However, there is no sign that the U.S. is considering to stop offensive weapons transfers, as you all probably know. In fact, the U.S. has accelerated deliveries and increased the amount of weapons to Israel above the $3.8 billion per year Israel receives. The EU and the UK are considering holding back weapons to Israel in light of the ICJ decision. If they take such a decision, it would put pressure on the U.S. to take some action as well to suspend weapons to Israel. Certainly, continuing to supply weapons to Israel while other countries institute an embargo would lend support for allegations that the U.S. is complicit in genocide. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Zaha. Thank you, Maya. Thanks to all the conveners today. So all of you here, of course, and those watching, understand the critical need for life-saving humanitarian support in Gaza. And sitting in this room in the same city where the Democratic National Convention is taking place, we all know how deeply important it is for our elected officials to also understand this as well. Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinian refugees, they need unhindered access to humanitarian assistance unprecedented in modern history. And at the same time, humanitarian aid is being attacked like no other time in history. I'm Mara Kronenfeld. I'm the executive director of UNRWA USA, and providing critical humanitarian assistance to Palestinian refugees has been the mission, of course, of UNRWA over the last 76 years, and has been also the mission of UNRWA USA since it was founded in 2005. You also might have heard about UNRWA in the news recently, as Israel has made numerous unfounded accusations against the agency. One accusation is that 19 members of UNRWA's 30,000 employees may or may not have taken part in the horrific events of October 7th in Israel. In the case of 9 of these employees, and that is 0.0003 of UNRWA's workforce, where Israel has presented evidence that, if authenticated and corroborated, could indicate said staff were guilty, UNRWA fired the individuals. UNRWA's Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, has stated over and over again, emphatically, that the engagement of any UNRWA employees in such activities would, in fact, be an appalling betrayal of Palestine refugees and of UNRWA. I've had the privilege of working at UNRWA USA alongside a group of amazing colleagues for almost 5 years now. And one of those colleagues, Hani Almadhoun, is in the room today, and he spoke earlier so movingly about his family's horrific experience in Gaza. I feel like Hani's a national treasure, by the way, and I know we all feel that we need to protect him. So Hani, I always tell him to take a day off too. I hope he's listening. I happen to come myself to this work from a specific background. My grandfather escaped Nazi Germany in 1934, and he fled to the US. His sister and his sister's family were killed in the Holocaust. My grandfather arrived in this country, and he said, "Never again. Never again shall a group of people be brutalized for where they happen to be born, what faith they happen to hold dear, who they are." And I happened to marry a wonderful Moroccan man. Our kids are nus-nus, or half-half as they say in Arabic, and believe me, their Jewish side is no more human than their Arab and Muslim side. And their Muslim side and their Arab sides are no more human than their Jewish side. I do the work I do today because of the legacy of my grandfather and his message that not just one religion or one group of people needs to be protected, but all. I will be speaking for the next 12 or so minutes and want to share with you what I'll be discussing. So I want to start my remarks by giving you a little context, a little bit of the condensed history of this last 76 plus years, which brings us to this moment. It will be very condensed. And then I want to describe the current catastrophic, apocalyptic conditions, humanitarian conditions on the ground in Gaza. And then I want to help you understand that even in the middle of an active war zone, thousands of UNRWA staff are risking their lives every day to provide essential humanitarian and life-saving aid in Gaza. Lastly, recognizing that we are having this discussion, again, in the context of a political convention in this city, with different factions and different viewpoints, I want all of us in this room and on the call today to understand the cynical and dark politicization of humanitarian aid that is taking place in our country right now, and particularly the political pressure that UNRWA's life-saving humanitarian services are under. That said, my overall message to you today is simple. The situation in Gaza is catastrophic and it is overwhelming. It might be easy for even the most caring and concerned of Americans to feel that they need to tune it out for their emotional survival, or because maybe there's just, some Americans might feel there's just nothing they can do. How can they make a difference? But I'm here to tell you that you can. The point of this talk is to leave you with two meaningful actions to take. One, call or write your elected representative and demand an immediate ceasefire in Gaza now. Your voice matters. And number two, while you're on the phone with them, demand the restoration of US government funding to UNRWA. And actually, you can do this right now if you go to unrwausa.org, UNRWAUSA.org, go to Advocate, and there's two letters that you can click on that will immediately go to your elected representatives. So now I'll turn to a little bit of context about UNRWA, which of course, I haven't spelled it out, but everyone in this room probably knows, is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. UN obligations to Palestinians began with the partition of Palestine under UN Resolution 181, which called for the end of the British mandate and the recommendation of the partition of Palestine into, of course, a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jewish agency accepted this partition plan, while the radicalized Irgun and Stern groups on the Jewish side rejected it, and the Arab states rejected it. On May 14, 1948, the British officially ended their mandate, and it was the day after, May 15th, that the Jewish agency proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel, resulting in the First Arab-Israeli War, and the forced displacement of some 760,000 Palestinian refugees in the Nakba. During the war, UN Resolution 194 then created the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine, the UNCCP, which was tasked with forging a political solution that would immediately realize the right of return of these Palestinian refugees, among other items. Unable to mediate the conflict effectively, the UNCCP was quickly overshadowed by UNRWA as the focus turned to dealing with the refugees in their host countries until a political solution was achieved. And then in 1949, UNRWA was established under UN Resolution 302 with a humanitarian and development mandate to provide assistance and protection to Palestine refugees pending a just and lasting solution to their plight. In practice, over the last 76 years, this has meant serving the essential food, health, shelter, protection, and education needs of some of the population of Palestine refugees, which grew from some 760,000 to now 5.6 million, that are located across UNRWA's 5 field sites of operation, which we know are Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and of course, Gaza. Now to the humanitarian situation right now. All of us in this room, all of us on the call today, we have seen the news. We know the unspeakable, unbearable horror that is taking place for millions of civilians in Gaza. I don't need to tell this room that Gaza has been decimated. 2/3 of all buildings have been destroyed. 84% of UNRWA's 200 some odd schools have been destroyed or heavily damaged. 11 universities in Gaza have been blown up. That's all the universities in Gaza. Hospitals, places of worship, and cemeteries have been targeted and destroyed, all violations of international humanitarian law. And we've reached the gruesome benchmark of over 40,000 deaths. I don't need to tell you that more than 2 million people are trapped in a living hell. Families have been displaced, sometimes up to 9 or 10 times in as many months. And 84% of the Strip, the civilian population has been forced out of 84% of the Gaza Strip. I don't need to tell you that children and women are bearing the brunt of this brutal war. There were some 50,000, imagine 50,000 pregnant women at the beginning when this conflict began. Imagine those pregnant women going for months without showers, waiting in lines of 500 to use the restroom, giving birth in absolutely unsanitary conditions. And I don't need to tell you that acute food insecurity is claiming the lives of multitudes of children, and that over 15,000 children, just like your children and my children, have been killed. Gaza also gruesomely holds the largest cohort of child amputees in history. This is why we want you to contact your local representatives and call for an immediate ceasefire. Until there's a ceasefire, children and families will continue to be blown up, and family members and neighbors will be forced to collect their body parts in plastic bags, as we've seen. Until there is a ceasefire, millions of people will be continually forced to relocate with what is left of their meager possessions on their backs. And until there's a ceasefire, aid workers, like those of UNRWA, like the thousands of UNRWA employees on the ground, will be under threat, and it will be extremely difficult for them to render the aid necessary to care for the millions facing acute hunger, critical injury, and abject trauma. Until there's a ceasefire, there is no safe place in Gaza. However, even without a ceasefire, there is aid being rendered as we speak, and this aid must be supported. While Americans see the horror of what is happening, at least those tuning in, what many do not see in the headlines is the help being given by UNRWA, by other UN agencies, and by numerous smaller aid groups. You can only imagine, given the catastrophic conditions, how hard it has been to deliver aid in this war zone. Yet UNRWA is putting food in the hands of families. UNRWA has provided 1.1 million people with emergency food aid in Gaza. That's more than half the population. 1.9 million people in Gaza, almost the whole population, with flour. UNRWA is treating the wounded. UNRWA staff, do you know they see 20,000 patients a day? in 9 clinics. There used to be 26 clinics, but 15 have been damaged or destroyed, and 100 mobile units that are going to the places where refugees have fled. And because of the destruction of the hospital system in Gaza, UNRWA now has become one of the largest medical providers in Gaza. Can you believe that? You know how many good hospitals there were in Gaza. And UNRWA was only meant to treat primary and secondary care, not tertiary care. UNRWA is providing trauma relief. It supports over 450,000 children and 250,000 adults with trauma care. And UNRWA is working tirelessly to prevent a lost generation of children who will be forced, if this goes on, to miss out on their education. UNRWA has started a Back to Learning program, just starting with 28,000 children where safety allows, either in the shelters or just outside of them. And this education is on mental health. It's mental health support, it's informal education, and it's education on unexploded ordnances, because this is also a real threat to children's lives. They hope to scale this up to 600,000, of course, if conditions allow. Now, even in this setting where aid is being provided under such terrible, horrific conditions, there are attacks against UNRWA. Even with all the good that UNRWA is doing, and maybe even because of it, UNRWA is facing virulent and extremely dangerous attacks, both physically and politically. 207 UNRWA staff members have paid for their work with their lives in Gaza. This is the highest number of UN workers killed in a conflict in UN history. Gaza-based staff have been detained by Israeli security forces and subsequently reported mistreatment and, as we know, even torture. There are legislative proposals by Israeli lawmakers to evict the agency from its premises in East Jerusalem and to call it, and by doing so, call it a terrorist organization. In the US, some legislators are attempting to prevent US government funding to UNRWA permanently. What is the reason? What is the reason for these attacks? In reality, UNRWA represents an uncomfortable truth that its detractors don't want to accept. UNRWA is targeted because of its role in keeping Palestinians alive, because of its role in safeguarding the rights of Palestine refugees, and because it embodies the international community's commitment to a just and lasting political solution. In essence, UNRWA is being attacked precisely because it keeps alive 2 essential truths. One, the very existence of a Palestinian refugee, and alongside it, the promise of a future Palestinian state. As the executive director of UNRWA USA, I know how diligently UNRWA takes the responsibility of its neutrality and its humanitarian mission. The independent Kelowna report, commissioned earlier this year, found that UNRWA's neutrality practices are among the most robust of any UN agency working today. And last month, 118 UN member countries, including the United States and all members of the UN Security Council, came together to express their shared commitment to UNRWA, declaring UNRWA is the backbone of all humanitarian response in Gaza, and they expressed appreciation for UNRWA's dedication to its humanitarian principles, including the principle of neutrality. In closing, we live in a time when humanitarian aid itself is under attack. This is where UNRWA and UNRWA USA need your support. Please tell your friends and your loved ones the real work of our mission and the support we need in the face of these dark and cynical attacks on the work of humanitarian actors. We can transform this dark and ugly politicization of our crucial work, and you can help us. Remember, you can help us by writing your elected rep, asking for a ceasefire now and the restoration of US funding for UNRWA. Go to unrwausa.org, go to Advocate, tell your friends, tell everyone you know to do so. And also, if you don't get the representative, which we know happens more and more, go ahead and talk to their young staffers. These young staffers are the future leaders of this country. We cannot let apathy get in the way of our advocacy, and advocacy, frankly, is being annoyingly persistent. Finally, some brief final personal reflections. As I said, the war on Gaza is overwhelming. The videos that come across our phones, our computer screens, our TVs are unbearable. Like the one of Mohammed Abul Qumsan fainting in grief in the hospital where he went to pick up the birth certificates of his 4-day-old twins, only to learn they had been killed along with their mother by an Israeli airstrike while he was in transit. And frankly, this one I read in the middle of the workday about a week ago, and I doubled over in pain. I'm the mother of twins. Of course, the trauma that we feel, each of us, is nothing like those that are feeling that trauma that is being felt by those on the ground. However, I tell myself all of the time, and I tell my beloved American friends from every ethnic and religious and political background, each of us, I don't have to tell this room, but I tell everybody else, we have to stop and let ourselves see these videos. Like our colleague said in the last panel, we have to stop and see them. We have to let them sink in. We have to feel them. We have to let ourselves be human to be affected. When you're human, you feel pain. And when you feel pain, you act. Thank God for those brave souls who took action and protected Jews during the Holocaust. Thank God for those who took in my grandfather's niece to try to protect her before she was sent to the gas chambers. And thank God the US took in my grandfather. Thank you to those who choose to speak out for Palestinian humanity today. History will not forget you. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaha, and thank you, Mara, for, we've had multiple conversations grounded in different ways. I said that human beings have to be human beings, right, and respond to what we're experiencing collectively and seeing. As Mara said, we have to look at those images. But we also have a responsibility as the United States of America, who is, through these policies, enabling what's happening. And the importance of hearing from both of you about our legal obligations, not just the moral obligations, but our legal obligations to Palestinians and the state of Palestine is absolutely critical. So I want to take this opportunity, Mara, to start with where you mentioned, but I want you and Zaha both to say more. The attacks on UNRWA as an institution that provides aid to Palestinians, but so much more. The education, the services, and the issue of the 6 million Palestinian refugees, that if you eliminate UNRWA, then you can potentially remove what is deemed a final status issue off the table. That has been the objective for some time now, both in terms of congressional resolutions that have sought to do this, and in a post-October 7th environment, it seems that the state of Israel has decided this is the way to do this. So if you can both speak to that a little bit more to help us understand why the attacks on UNRWA were so aggressive and continue to be.
Well, thank you for the question. It's one of the most egregious things to me, to be frank, of all of the attempts to eliminate the final status issue. The idea of disposing of the reality of the, half of the Palestinian population are exiles or refugees. 5.8 million are residents of refugee camps. The idea that just by forcing them out of the camp, somehow they stop being refugees legally, it's not true. And it doesn't wipe out their claims, their interests, their lives, unless you can figure out a way to ethnically cleanse them from outside the area and hope that there will never be accountability for doing so, or, as we're seeing in Gaza, a case of genocide is committed. What's so egregious about the attempt to discredit UNRWA and to turn it into what Israel would like to turn it into, which is a terrorist organization, to throw that label on UNRWA, is that, as you said, Mara, there is only one international organization, one entity inside of Gaza that can provide the kind of humanitarian assistance that is needed to be able to save Palestinian lives in Gaza and prevent further mass killing, to prevent the starvation, to provide nutrition and the primary and secondary health care that's needed to save Palestinians from death. I mentioned this in an earlier panel, but we know that in every conflict like this, for every person that dies, 2 or 3 more will die from the aftermath of a military campaign. So we have 40,000 Palestinians dead. So we know double that or triple that number will die. That's even if we had a ceasefire tomorrow. It's so critically important to have health care. It's so critically important to provide nutrition for people to stop them from dying of acute malnutrition. It's so important to be able to provide all of the different kinds of care that UNRWA provides right now. And if they weren't around, it's impossible to be able to address all of these things. And remember what I said earlier. The International Court of Justice, in a legally binding case, said Israel must provide immediate and effective measures to ensure that that doesn't happen, that the Palestinian lives can be saved that are still in Gaza. And instead, on the very same day that that decision came down in January is the day that UNRWA, funding was suspended from UNRWA by the United States, which is a heavy contributor to UNRWA. So again, I say this, to me, Palestine is its people, and this effort against UNRWA is really aimed at literally liquidating the Palestinian issue, one human being at a time.
I absolutely, Zaha, and you have to know in Gaza that up until October 7th, UNRWA essentially served over 60% of the population in Gaza and was the de facto Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Civic Planning, Civic Works and Planning. So UNRWA was providing education to half of all young children in Gaza before the siege of Gaza started. UNRWA was providing the primary and secondary care for more than half of Gaza. So UNRWA was literally, and also food assistance, for about 50% of the population was receiving food assistance through UNRWA. So UNRWA was literally keeping people alive. Remember that Gaza was under a 17-year blockade of air, sea, and land. So it wasn't easy to get products, to get food, to get commercial products, to get even medical products into Gaza. UNRWA was providing these essential services when there was no other way for people to get them. And then also because of that blockade, young people in Gaza, or anybody in Gaza, had trouble finding work. So UNRWA was also providing the education and training that would help these young people get jobs in the cloud economy. So you can't help but go to that conclusion that Zaha went to, which is that getting rid of UNRWA is really trying to get rid of the Palestinian people one by one and the promise of a Palestinian state. Now, the right of return does not depend on UNRWA's existence. It's in the United Nations, but it is something that UNRWA is associated with. But by killing off UNRWA, you can't kill off that right of return. Let's just make that clear. But I also think this was something that was kind of in Arabic tahta tawla before a little bit, right? It was under the table. It wasn't spoken about. But now what's fascinating is the right wing in Israel has said the quiet part out loud, right? They've said anybody born of that land in Gaza is born a terrorist. They're animals. They're snakes. That there can't be an innocent child in Gaza. So of course UNRWA is complicit if you're feeding and educating baby terrorists. So I think it's all part of the rhetoric which allows you to decimate a whole population, their institutions of learning, their mosques, their few churches, their cemeteries, their hospitals, if you can demonize all of them, and if you can demonize the organization that's keeping them alive.
So in the middle of unprecedented starvation in the area, an extraordinary need, the agency, the only agency capable of feeding the population, has its funding cut by the United States based on allegations that have since been demonstrated to be completely false, because of the political agenda that we're talking about. So it's egregious to do at any time, but it's particularly difficult to hear in the context of the ongoing starvation that the Palestinian population is experiencing. If you could both, or maybe Zaha, I give this one to you on the congressional piece of it. The U.S. was quick, didn't our executives behind the podiums, both at the executive branch and the State Department, didn't say we will wait for an investigation. They were quick to cut off U.S. assistance to UNRWA, and they have not resumed it, though the majority of all other countries have. Can you speak to the status of that now?
Yeah, you know, it was interesting for me because I think it was a week after the U.S. suspended immediately its assistance to UNRWA that I had a conversation with a group of officials from the State Department, and I asked them, you know, why would you take this decision without having, you know, any kind of evidence in front of you to justify this, number one. Number two, assume that there was a few people that did some criminal activity. Would you go and destroy the building they worked in? Would you go and, you know, criminalize the entire organization that works with them? So I wanted to understand, why did the U.S. take this decision? And the response was, well, we didn't see the evidence, but we know that it was enough because UNRWA told us that they saw the evidence, and so they fired these people. So that told us that it was fine, you know, that we needed to take action as well. That was incredibly unsatisfying to me because I think it was just a few days later that there was a report about the evidence or lack thereof that when I'll let you discuss that, Mara, but just all to say that, you know, that the U.S. administration, not Congress, took this action, but for many, many years, for at least a decade, there's been a concerted effort to try to undermine UNRWA in Congress, and it hasn't happened. They haven't been able to shut it down. And so even though the U.S. administration took this position early on, once it was clear that there was no evidence or that there wasn't substantial evidence of a problem within UNRWA, why didn't the U.S. just allow the funding to turn on the tap again and allow funding to UNRWA? Then Congress was able to drive right in and say, okay, well, we want to suspend aid to UNRWA, and now they finally had something to go on. They could say, hey, the administration just suspended aid. All these countries around the world that support UNRWA suspended aid, so now we're going to suspend aid too, and it passed. But it passed until next year in March. But there are efforts to try to make that suspension turn into a permanent reality where U.S. no longer can fund UNRWA. So that's where we are today. And the administration will say, oh, it's out of our hands now. Congress is acting, so we can't really, we want to give back to UNRWA. We recognize the important work they're doing. We understand the International Court of Justice said we need to make sure that humanitarian aid is getting in, and we have an obligation under the Genocide Convention, but we got Congress. What can we do? So that's where we have things left right now.
Yeah, and actually when this news came out, and I think basically the Israeli authorities gave this news essentially that there were some members of UNRWA who may or may not have been involved in the horrific events of October 7th. It went to Wall Street Journal, New York Times first, and then I think somehow the UN Secretary General got a hold of it, called in the Commissioner General. Commissioner General was informed, and the Commissioner General and the Secretary General decided, essentially, from what my understanding is, that they would fire the people who Israeli authorities had indicated may or may not have taken part. They did this, what the Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini will say himself, they did this in a process of reverse due diligence. And they're actually facing probably, I think from the UN Union right now, some issues regarding that, right? Because they're not a criminal investigatory authority. They have no ability to do that. But on the other side of that, that is how seriously UNRWA takes its mandate. That if there was somebody who was accused of such an egregious act, they fired them without even going through due diligence to make sure their humanitarian mandate stayed and was unquestionable. And yet it still was questionable. And like Zaha said, we always had these mental kind of experiments we ran back in my house and with my family. We were like, if 7 or 8 or 12 members of the US Postal Service were found to be caught in a criminal gang, were murdering whatever, do we shut down the whole US Postal Service? Or do we take that criminal gang, prosecute it, put those people in jail? So also what Zaha said, the reason this even took hold was because there's been a concerted campaign against UNRWA for decades. And that campaign, there's certain, I won't even give the organization the airtime right now by naming the organization that's been leading this campaign, but it's based on a lot of false information and distortions. And unfortunately, many members of our Congress have taken this campaign and the leader of this campaign at face value. And, I'm not in politics, and I shouldn't be so naive just being around long enough, but truth is just, goes by the wayside, right? Truth is not relevant here. And so they're actually taking information about UNRWA's textbooks being anti-Semitic, and I can tell you as a Jewish person that's fundamentally not true, and making people in Congress fearful that UNRWA is somehow anti-Semitic. That's been there for years, and that has been building the case has been building, so to speak, to this moment.
You can call it the Palestine exception or the Israel exception. I don't know which way to call it, but both are applicable here. And to be clear on the point about Congress as bad actors in this space in many ways, there is also an effort to restore funding immediately to UNRWA that is underway as well among some congressional members who understand and have the context that we're discussing at this panel. Just to put a fine point on the issue of the politics of this, even at the time that the U.S. cut off the assistance, there was an open discussion in Washington that we understand the need. We're just having other partners shift dollars so that we'll continue to feed the starving Palestinians. But in doing it that way, as illustrated by exceptionally right colleagues, undermining Palestinians' rights, legal obligations, is fine, it seemed, right? So we can feed you, but the discussion of your liberation, the discussion of your human rights, the discussion of your self-determination, the discussion of the world's legal obligations to you can go to the wayside. And that, as you can imagine, that didn't sit well with a lot of experts on this issue in Washington in these policy circles, because that's not the way that you lead. To tell me that we managed to shift dollars here so the impact is minimized doesn't address the point of the campaign against UNRWA for decades, to, again, remove the nearly 6 million Palestinians as an issue for whatever would or would not happen with regards to the final status issues. I want to come back to we have these discussions all the time about nobody in Washington cares about international law, that it doesn't enter into the policy conversations generally. Ukraine, obviously, is an exception in different ways. But if you can speak to the folks here and those who've joined us online, because they care deeply about this issue, and this narrative on this issue is exceptionally important, how does one introduce that into their conversation with either policymakers or state-level officials, just to bring us back to the fact that there are requirements for what should be done?
Yeah, look, to be clear, international law, human rights, does matter to members of the administration, to members of Congress, like you said, in some contexts, right? But in others, it's been systematically deprioritized and even framed as an obstacle. Like, we shouldn't focus too much on international law. It's not helpful to getting people to a political agreement, you know, so let's just put it aside. How do we get, you know, how do we change this mindset that on certain subjects, hot subjects, politically hot subjects, how do we change this mindset that international law is not relevant? I think what we do is we point to what's happening in Gaza right now, and we say it is hugely significant when you deprioritize human rights and you deprioritize international law. What happens is it signals to not just our adversaries, but also to our allies that they can commit these kinds of mass atrocities. There will be no political accountability for it, and that doesn't bode well for us. If we identify ourselves, the United States, as Israel's special friend, and if we provide Israel with exorbitant amounts of security assistance, weapons, 2,000-pound bombs, and all of these weapons that we're seeing deployed and really tested in Gaza, then we become part of the human rights violation. We can no longer say that we are going to be the moral, legal leader in the world, that we're going to restore leadership. That's a quote from the new platform, by the way, this restoring global leadership. How can we say that we aim to restore global leadership when we're leading the genocide in a lot of ways because we're continuing to arm Israel? So it's not just a question of you know, the morality of what's going on. I mean, there are repercussions to the U.S. national interest, and I think Congress and members of the administration, that's what we can appeal to until we can better humanize Palestinians, because unfortunately what I have learned over the last 10 plus months is that there's such an atrocious amount of dehumanization that we have to fight against. People don't know Palestinians. They don't understand the history. They have been provided with a lot of disinformation about Palestinians, and that has to be remedied if we hope to change policy, because honestly, at the end of the day, policy is about empathy. If you cannot empathize with a people, you can't impact policy, and that's what we've been challenged with.
Mara, if I appreciate that, Zaha, but if, as in, for example, the case of the Biden administration, where we didn't necessarily lean into the human international law as is common among U.S. administrations, but they did declare that there was this significant emphasis they were going to play on a rules-based order. That's the narrative we got when the Biden administration came into power post-Trump. From either one of you, as you have these conversations about what U.S. policy should be towards UNRWA or the broader issues of addressing the occupation, the apartheid situation, the genocide now, how does that come up in the conversations with folks in Washington on this? Does it come up, the policy of a rules-based order in this space?
No. It really, like I said, it gets deprioritized. And I want to make a distinction between international law and the rules-based order, okay? Because rules-based order is talking about sort of the framework that was put into place after World War II, and which was not really an equal framework for all players, all international actors. We have a Security Council where we have 5 permanent members that get to like veto resolutions so that things that go against the major powers, at least one of them, don't ever see the light of day. So that's the rules-based order that the U.S. is talking about. When we talk about international law, we're talking about this body of law, both Security Council resolutions, but also customary international law, human rights conventions, and all of that. And we're saying that those things are without regard to how big or small a state is, or the worth of one population or one people being greater than another. We're all equal on that playing field. And so when Palestinians talk about international law, or legal experts talk about international law, they're talking about that whole panoply. When we talk about the rules-based order, we're talking about that system that has benefited and privileged certain powers over others. And so, yes, they'll talk about the rules-based order, but they'll also qualify it when it's Palestine. So it's okay for the U.S. to exceptionalize Israel by vetoing resolutions that every other member inside of the Security Council, permanent members and non-permanent members alike, because it's protecting the peace process. So then the rules-based order gets thrown out the window, and we just talk about, political reasons for why the U.S. isn't so compliant with even the rules-based order.
Yeah, and just the one other related comment, but a little bit as an aside. I don't know if you saw the op-ed by Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini in the New York Times, but this was a couple of months ago. But what he said was, if Israel and the U.S. are continuing to be so effective at demonizing UNRWA, what's next is the UN. Is the rules-based order. And we already have Republicans, telling us we don't have any reason for the United Nations or to support international programs at all. So it's a domino effect. UNRWA's the beginning, and it will, unfortunately or fortunately, however you say it, Palestine won't just be the exception. In this case, there won't be support for the United Nations, period, if we let this kind of demonization go on.
We've told you each day that we have an opportunity for questions from the audience, and then we run out of time and not actually allow you to ask questions. So we have a microphone right there in the back. If anyone would like to ask a question, I'm happy to open it up for that at this time. And while okay. Sure. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful panel. I have a question for Mara. So I have some Facebook friends in the Gaza Strip, and they sometimes write to me and say, my children are hungry, sick, how can you help me? And I give regularly to United Palestinian Appeal, so I called them and I was like, what should I tell them? Can they go to you? Do you have food? And they told me, we have food, but the problem is getting it to people. But give us their number and we'll call them when we're in the area. And then I never hear any more as to whether these people got anything. So can you shed any light on what's going on here? Like, why are these people, I know there's, it's very dangerous to get out and the roads are broken and things like that, but can you shed any light on how people are getting access to the resources that are in Gaza from these nonprofits?
Should I go ahead and answer that? Okay. Yes, so you hit upon, you essentially answered your question in the question, which is this situation on the ground is that difficult. And that's for many reasons. So one is, I don't know if any of you saw these pictures of the miles and miles long of trucks, of convoys trying to get into Rafah before the Israeli army had taken control of Rafah. The reason there were lines and lines of trucks with food and medical equipment was because of the inspections process, by the Israelis, which they would go into those trucks, and if they found one thing that was not allowable, and that thing could be a crutch, it could be water desalination tablets, it could be a tent pole that's not allowable, they would send the whole truck back to the back of that line. And so there were the number of trucks that could get in, especially in the first 5 months or so, was completely limited by the inspections process. And then another thing that was going on is that UNRWA would deconflict where they're going to go with that food. Because UNRWA, even if World Food Program, WHO, ANER, all these great organizations, take Hani's own organization aside because it's different, but all the organizations that are foreign, that are bringing food or medical supplies in, the distribution of those supplies is reliant upon UNRWA, because UNRWA has the thousands of people on the ground and the trucks, the logistic services that can get those food and medical services to people in need. So UNRWA would say, we're going to go to the north of Gaza and deliver this, and the Israelis would say, great, you're a humanitarian org, go ahead. And then they would either bomb them, or they would say, nope, you can't go anymore. So, and this, I don't know, there's a statistic at some moment of all the requests for deconfliction, half of them that were granted were not actually, UNRWA was not actually able to do the delivery of food and services. So that's up at 4 or 5 months ago. Now recently, with most of the food and medical supplies coming in through Karim Abu Salem, there's a breakdown in order. So there's actually armed gangs, there's actual and also, Israel has not allowed for a safe humanitarian corridor in which they could get that food through. So instead, they're going through a war zone, and they're being shot at, whether by the Israelis or other armed actors on the ground. So in a sense, I feel, this is my own speculation, but it's kind of obvious. Israel has made the situation so chaotic and disastrous that it's not possible to provide humanitarian food and assistance effectively. It's simply not possible in that setting. So I commiserate so much with these people. I can tell you that on my own Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, there are 100, if not 200 of those requests. I put them all at once on my LinkedIn and say, please, anybody who's donating, look at these. I can't vouch for them personally, whatever, but every day I get somebody writing the same thing, and it's horrific. Please.
Hi, thank you very much for this panel. One of the criticisms that Israeli propagandists make about UNRWA is that since it's unique to the Palestinians and it's separate from the UN's other refugee operations, it creates a unique situation where refugee status is handed down from generation to generation. Now, I understand that that's false, and I wonder if you could explain that so that I can explain it to the people that I hear it from. Thank you.
And I'll let Zaha if she has further commentary than I have, but absolutely it is false that it's unique. UNHCR has the same. It's handed down to descendants. UNRWA was established for a specific mandate, which was caring for a population that had been forcibly displaced from where they lived into at least 5 different host settings. And UNRWA was forced to provide for the basic needs of this population. It was supposed to be temporary. If you've heard of the idea of planned obsolescence, right? Of electronic equipment. The idea was that once there was a just and durable political solution for the refugees, they returned home. There was no need for this organization. So it wasn't meant to last 76 years. So I say to those other people, by all means, UNRWA doesn't want to exist. UNRWA would very much like to, we'd be happy for the day that we don't have to ask American people for money, because that means there's a just and durable political solution for the plight of Palestine refugees.
I think that answer was perfect. I just want to highlight one thing. I mean, before there was this drive to label UNRWA a terrorist organization after October 7th and these allegations that were made against UNRWA, there was an initiative in Congress to try to abolish basically UNRWA bit by saying exactly this idea, that it shouldn't apply to descendants. It should only be the people that were alive in 1948 who became refugees, and the descendants shouldn't be included. And that was an initiative that aimed at, slowly basically allowing for the dying off, literally, of UNRWA's mandate. Obviously, UNRWA wasn't created by the United States Congress. It was created by the UN General Assembly, and it has a specific mandate, and the only one that can change UNRWA's mandate is the UN, and it hasn't decided to do so.
It was created by the United Nations after the United Nations partition of Palestine. So the linkages are quite clear in terms of why it's there and why it needs to be there, to Mara's point.
Yeah, and roughly every 3 years, again, it's that mandate is reaffirmed by the member states of the UN. So it's not UNRWA's mandate, it's the world community's mandate. Please.
Thank you. And thank you for your vivid expertise. I teach experiential human rights learning, and we try to challenge folks who are helping to have experiences that surprise and also help them think differently about things, give them a different perspective that they might not have considered before. Since October 7th, we've been facing the challenge of helping people really learn about what's going on in a way that really helps them see. And I was wondering what wit, wisdom, what primary sources, including experiences, including hard data and databases and things like that, and also even concepts or experiences people can pursue in the real world to help them learn for self-study or for teaching about this subject. Thank you so much.
Wonderful question. Thank you. I will let my colleagues go first.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on this, so I'll definitely, I'll try to be brief, but there's so much. So first of all, go to UNRWA USA, our website, and you will have the testimonials of people who've gone through UNRWA's education system and are here in the US, are US citizens who are doctors. You won't even guess. They're your doctors, your lawyers, your neighbors, your congressperson, okay? Or the daughters and sons of those people. So you'll see many great stories of people who've come out of UNRWA education and the important work they're doing as Americans right now, as Palestinian Americans. Also, I will tell you that I always try to talk about my personal experience. I went to Gaza in 2022. Thank God I got to get there and see. And I talked to people who've been there. I went through the 60-foot walls of this dystopian border between Israel and Gaza. I went in and was shocked, mind you, by the smiles, by how people are living and finding joy in the most difficult of circumstances. And what my colleagues at UNRWA USA, Layla Elabed, Hani, and I do is we show the picture of this medical center before and after. I have pictures of the kids of Jabalia camp coming up to me, wanting to meet me. I don't even know if those kids are alive today. So I try to do that, at least share my experience. And then finally, sometimes I reflect on this question all the time. I'm sure we all have so many thoughts. You know, I think so many people haven't, Palestinians, but it's the whole Arab world that's been dehumanized too. Terrorists, fundamentalists, extremists, radical. So many people haven't been. And so just encouraging the study abroad, encouraging the Fulbright, encouraging travel, encouraging learning another language, how much insight you get into another culture. I am who I am today, not only because my grandfather, but because I lived in the Middle East for many, many years. I lived in Syria. I visited Palestine many times. I've been all over the Gulf region. So anything anybody says, I'm like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I was there. I'm Jewish. I was in Gaza, and I was treated the most hospitably I've been treated ever anywhere in my life. So travel is key, and Interfaith Peace Builders, which is now Eyewitness Palestine, I used to be on the board, brings delegations of Americans. Fellowship of Reconciliation was here. Encourage people to go visit of all faiths and backgrounds. I could talk forever, and I'm going to stop.
That was great, everything you said. I associate myself with, with it all. I also agree, experiential learning is amazing. I've taken staffers and members of Congress on educational trips, and it's transformative. You learn more walking in the streets of Hebron in 1 hour than you could ever do in years of college, and people understand it. They get it like that. All of a sudden, Palestine's not so complicated. They understand right away what's going on. So, I mean, that's a very important way to do it. Not everyone can do that. There are great resources. The UN Office of the Humanitarian Coordinator has amazing data that you can use to understand what's taking place in Palestine, the occupied territories. There is a UN information source on Palestine that has all of the historical documents and a lot of great material over the years from the different UN bodies and agencies that deal with Palestine. And then there's great human rights organizations that have been doing so much incredible work, like Beit Salem, like Al-Haq in Ramallah, like Adala inside Israel on the rights of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So I can give you lists and go on, but I think that's a great start for you and a way to get immersed in what's going on. Thank you.
I would offer two things. One is something I do that is wrong, which is that, if not clear from our conversation, I tend to fixate on facts. I'm really deeply rooted in this sort of the analytical piece of this and the law and the data and the U.S. obligations. That doesn't work often. People are storytellers. People need narratives. And I think that's across the board, but it's particularly the case when you have anti-Arab racism so normalized in our country, and specifically the dehumanization of Palestinians so common in our country. So that's the first point, is understand that you have to break through some of the facts. And it's hard not to share these facts because they're true and they're important, and you just profoundly are confused as to why they don't matter. But I think that's the first point. The second point I would make is we don't have the privilege of just being right and speaking to ourselves. We cannot sit around talking to each other, as much as I love everyone here. It has got to get bigger, as it has. Our young people are the ones post-October 7th who've expanded this issue in a way, you've heard it from multiple people on the stage. We didn't think in our lifetime that would be happening. Folks, we had a member of Congress yesterday say ceasefire for Gaza, and the crowd erupted in applause. I didn't hear the rest of it because I just heard the applause to that. This is a member of Congress who was given 90 seconds last time around because they were required to. It is a leader in the party who made a huge speech, and as much as I think people should do things because they're right, your people are doing things now because it's also the right thing to do in order to attract voters. The politics of it is also right. So the second part is to just try to meet someone where they're at, and the way I kind of talk about this is the atrocities committed on October 7th, both by Hamas and other actors as well as Israel. People can see themselves or their kids at a concert. People cannot see themselves living under 56 years of occupation. People don't see themselves going through a checkpoint. They can see themselves at a rave having fun. They don't see the dehumanization and the brutality that Palestinians have endured and continue to endure. And that's the part of it, is because sometimes like, how do you not see this? And you get frustrated, but you have to meet them where they're at so that you can expand the conversation. And I think those are the two things I would highlight. Let's go to another question.
Yes, thank you. There's two types of genocide that we can see. One is what we're talking about, and it's happening between the Zionist settlers in Palestine in the 20th century. But the other type of genocide we're familiar with is that of European settlers in America against the indigenous population. I don't hear much discussion about that, comparisons and contrasts between these two different types of genocide. I wonder if any of the panelists would like to comment.
I'm sorry if I understood correctly. I looked down about the experience of the American Indian to here in the United States. Yeah, it's certainly one. I'm happy to share with you something that when we have a new employee at the Arab American Institute, one of the things that we share with them is something that Jim had written many years ago about the similarities between the narrative here in the United States and the stories we have to tell ourselves in order to kind of continue to do what we do, and the experience of Palestinians. But I would ask my colleagues to share anything else.
No, for me, I think about the harm, the human rights violation, rather than necessarily the fact. I mean, every violation like that of indigenous rights, of human rights of a people has similarities, and we understand those in terms of human rights law and international law in general. I think people that have gone through those kinds of traumas have a lot to learn from each other about resilience and survival, and about how to develop strategies to combat. I mean, the Native American situation is ongoing. It's not something in the past. And there have been dialogues between Palestinians and indigenous populations and sharing of strategies and of showing up for each other. And so that is happening, and I think it's very helpful in terms of the people-to-people sort of support that offers. But in terms of human rights law, it's the harms that are and the violations that are the common binding essence between those different contexts.
It's honestly been there for a very long time, but in the post-October 7th, you're also seeing in very visible ways at the demonstrations that organized groups are presenting and doing so together. We have room, I think, for one more question, then I'm going to ask for, please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your bravery and your hard work. It's ongoing and it's heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. I'm Keisha. I'm originally from Michigan. I grew up in Ann Arbor, and now I live in a place called East Texas, and it is not, there's no place like home. There's no place like Ann Arbor. And I'm in a place where on October 8th, when Joe Biden said that he stands with Israel, now my Facebook Live was not very, I dropped a couple of F-bombs, like, who are we? That doesn't, you don't speak for me. And when you grow up in Ann Arbor, it's a different kind of education. We have the biggest Middle Eastern population outside the Middle East in Dearborn. But when you go to East Texas, you are fighting a different kind of evil that you never thought of before, and that evil that you're fighting is grown right there in their churches. The Christian evangelicists are probably the worst sector of hate that I have ever seen. They beat the Klan. And they beat the Klan because they do it so under the radar that you're not watching these churches that are popping up in the South and all over the country. You just watch it, something pops up, and all of a sudden, these groups have enough power to make sure the 10 Commandments are in the school systems. I was blacklisted and whatnot, and I'm pretty sure that happened to you all, and it's happened to me, but we still continue to fight. I'm talking to these people, and I'm trying to educate them, and you will not believe, because before, we could never get past the iron dome of propaganda that anytime you criticize Israel, you are anti-Semitic. But now these young people have pushed that line, and they're pushing back. But what I need help with is the psychological makeup of these that have been taught since this young, that there is an apocalypse coming, that Jesus is coming back, and that these people need to die. And the proper, I wish I was lying. I really wholeheartedly, I remember this first time that somebody told me this, I said, you lying. You're not taught this. We're taught about Jesus is coming back, but that doesn't mean that we wipe out a whole group of people and we say that it's okay.
Thank you for the question. It's come up before when we talk about the pro-Israel camp and the need to understand how much Christian Zionists, and frankly, our military companies, military industrial complex companies as well, in terms of the role they play in advancing some of this. Either one of you want to comment on that?
I mean, yeah, just like one of the speakers on the prior panel said, that the Christian Zionists are both the most pro-Israel and the most anti-Semitic people that they know. So, yeah, no friend of mine, I'll tell you that. I can't answer that. That's a real good question, and I don't know how you get at that. But I do know that I've had family members, Zionist family members, who are born and raised with the same, a different mythology, but a similar one, and I have had to just keep showing up to them as I am, and keep insisting on my lived experience as valid. And also, they like, I like Mara, she's a nice person. How could she have these thoughts about Israel and they have to somehow square it. And I've also had the case where my husband, as I said, was Moroccan. We go to their house for some event, and they say, you're from a good Arab country. They've said this to our faces, right? Haram. It's insane. So we use those moments, and we try to understand. My particular way is that you catch more flies with honey. Other people are going to swap those flies. But I want to have dialogue. because I want this conversation to be educational. I don't want it to cut off those connections that would allow people to change their mind. So in essence, I believe people can change their mind. I believe travel, I believe exposure, I believe human stories, storytelling. I believe, frankly, you've seen the young people, like you mentioned, if not now, and frankly, the progressive Jews who are getting up there and saying, not in my name, are making it possible, okay? Are making it very clear that you have to be critical of Israel, and that doesn't mean you're anti-Semitic. In fact, it's part of your Jewish ethos to be that way. So it's changing, and we hope these people catch up. I don't know, you have a good answer, Zaha? How are we gonna fix this?
Great. I mean, I don't work in those spaces, and I don't know, but I do know that, as you said, Mara, getting to know people makes it a whole lot harder for you to dehumanize them and kill them, or to advocate, that this is a solution of any kind. And so I think having, engaging with folks that have these belief systems and letting them meet Palestinians. Now, it feels like in this moment when we're talking about a genocide that's going on, that it's not a Palestinian's responsibility to go and try to convince others of their humanity. So I don't know, what that engagement looks like and who needs to be proactive in pursuing it. But I think it becomes very difficult to hold those kinds of beliefs and believe fundamentally in the love and mercy of Jesus at the same time as believing that, a whole population could be wiped out, and that's a necessary evil.
We are basically at time, but there's an online question that's been asked, and I want you to the question of the success of airdrops. How well did those go?
I mean, not successful. They are extremely expensive, and I wish I could tell you the order of expense, but something like 40 times the expense of sending a truckload of food in. The airdrops have killed people. Luckily not, God, I can't even talk this way. What am I saying? They have killed people. The food that has been dropped has landed on people and kids have swam out into the sea to get food. The airdrops are largely cosmetic to make people feel like they're doing something. I don't even want to talk about that floating pier, which came up and then went away after something major happened in one of the camps. So the truth is, trucks are the way that food and services get in the level that is needed to serve 2.1 million people and keep them from starving to death or dying from critical wounds or lack of health care. And now, mind you, polio, we've heard there is one case now of polio, a paralytic case. So it was in the environment, we've heard there is a case now. So right now, whatever you do, ceasefire, absolutely, and restore funding to UNRWA, and we need polio vaccines to get into Gaza. There are some there, but not enough. I mean, it was eradicated in Gaza for 25 years.
We're out of time, and I feel so bad for those who wanted to ask additional questions, but maybe you all can just hang out for a few more minutes after we're done. Close us out with, Mara, for you first, and then Zaha. At the same time that UNRWA has been under these extraordinary attacks, you've seen a tremendous amount of support build. If you can close us off with that, and then for you, Zaha, no pressure, but what's also making you more hopeful during this period, please?
Yeah, there's clearly, as everybody said today, there's a disconnect between our leaders and the people. And I have seen that with my own eyes. Early October of 2023, we had 11,000 donations. Pretty standard for us, about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the year. By the end of December 2023, we had 110,000 donations. We went from approximately $4 or $5 million, $7 million revenue to $32 million revenue last year, and this year we're at 33 halfway through the year. And this is nothing about UNRWA USA, although I do have a great team, mind you, the team is fantastic. But this is a measure of the American people saying this is wrong, and we need to protect civilians. And mind you, these people come from 49 states. Hawaii, somebody in Hawaii's got to donate, so I can say 50 states, we're not quite there yet. And they come from every walk of life. And I can tell you, and I wish I could tell the world, on Passover, how many Jewish people wrote and said, I am donating because Passover is about freeing the oppressed from affliction. And so I want to tell the world, and I'm thinking about how I can do this, maybe you guys have some ideas. I want to get in the biggest megaphone and say that our donors are from every walk of life, they're from every religious background, and they care about Palestinians, and they care about human life, and they care about the humanity of Palestinians. And you government people better catch on, because this community is only growing. That gives me hope.
So yesterday, I was sitting in the Airbnb in my room, typing away, and I heard this, it just creeped up on me, this sound. It was like this droning, and helicopters everywhere, and I just thought, what the hell is going on? I immediately I thought of Gaza. I thought, oh my, this is how they live every single day. The sound of drones over their head and not knowing what's going to happen around them. And then I heard this shouting and screaming, and I thought, oh my gosh, what is going on outside, And so I got out of my room and went outside and saw thousands and thousands of people demonstrating, Korean Americans for a ceasefire, Filipinos for a ceasefire, Jewish Voice for Peace, Christians for a ceasefire. I mean, it was like the most beautiful display of America right outside my room. And at a time when I was feeling like, oh my God, this is what my people in Gaza feel. I came outside and I thought, this is what my people in America, who they are, And so that gave me so much hope at a moment when I was just like, struggling with this idea of what's going on in Gaza. So that's my silver lining.
Thank you, Mara, both of you, for the incredible work that you do. I think it's all our silver linings. Thank you all for joining us. Listen, tomorrow is day 3, our final day of programming. We are focused tomorrow on the politics of this. We've done the substance, but it's, as we all know, deeply impacted by the politics. In the morning, we're going to do an analysis of the current party platform in relation to previous ones. Zaha mentioned it. There's a lot to talk about. And in the afternoon, we're going to talk, I'm sorry, it's not morning. It's 1 to 2:15 and then 2:30 to 4. I've been doing that all week. The second session, we're going to focus on actually kind of what Zaha's talking about, which is this mass movement and what it means for Americans generally, but specifically what it means in the progressive space. Are we finally at the point where that exception is gone? So please join us again, 1 to 4 Central tomorrow. Thank you.